And joining us here, we're about to kickstart our next segment that will talk more on issues that Michael was talking about. And Michael will be joined by the panelists that Yolanda will introduce to us. Of course, I think Debra is joining us online. And yeah, we can't wait. Those that are online, please be so kind and keep on sending your questions. Veli will be reading them to the panelists as you pick up the discussions, or from based on what Michael said earlier on, send those questions to us. We'll be able to. Otherwise, in the room, feel free to raise your hands and participate. Yolandi will be taking those hands and directing the questions where they should go. Without any further ado, please let us all welcome back Yolandi to the session.
Thank you, Vusi. I've got the panel members here with me on stage, and I'll be doing a quick introduction, and then we'll take clarifying questions on Michael's presentation before we ask our panel members to weigh in with their thoughts on the topic. So, to my left, Rashaad Amra. He is also a researcher at the Public Economic Project, and he has got 10 years experience in applied public policy. He has started his career in National Treasury's Economic Policy Division, so great to see him again. We've got some history together. Rashaad also advises on the legislature on fiscal policy, public finance, and economic policy at the Parliamentary Budget Office. And he was chiefly responsible for the office's macro fiscal and revenue modeling. So welcome, Rashaad. Debra Makwiramiti is online. She is a director for fiscal framework in the Budget Office of National Treasury. As the director, she works with the Chief Director Fiscal Policy, managing government's fiscal policy framework that underpins the annual budget review and medium-term budget policy statement publications. She also advises on fiscal and budgetary framework, extra budgetary accounts, and funds for the wider public finances. She has worked with National Treasury since September 2009 and has vast knowledge and experience on fiscal framework and policy matters. And then to my right, on the stage, we have Khetha Dlamini. He is also working at National Treasury. His academic credentials include bachelor's, honours, and master's degrees from the University of Witwatersrand, and those are complemented by a second master's degree from the University of Harvard. Khetha in 2022 served as a summer research fellow at the Balfour Centre for International Affairs under the leadership of Megan O'Sullivan, which was President Bush's national security advisor during the war in Iraq. And the focus was on African energy policy and contributing to the Africa in Focus program. Khetha continues to have substantial impact on policy planning and implementation in National Treasury. Welcome to all the panel members. Can I then ask for some clarifying questions on Michael's presentation that we had before the break? I'm going to take questions from the floor and then online. Dalu, from the floor. Do we have a roving mic?
Thank you, Yolanda. Greetings to the panelists and everyone part of the conference. Michael, let me appreciate, I think, your presentation. Of course, I could see also the influence of budget office coming through as part of the presentation. You spoke about element of growth, which is not complemented generally overall in terms of now sustainability. But now, I think the question, if you take the arcade demand, arcade supply, where are we going to reach the equilibrium? What do we need to do to reach that equilibrium? So that at least we understand. We're talking about managing COE. I think now it's more or less, as you have seen, below the inflation kind of. Maybe we've done more than what we could, But what else do we need to do? Is it a matter where we need to look at, does our budget have, cover the issue of structural element for the growth? And what are those? Maybe, do we need to look in terms of industrial development, change the approach in terms from a budgeting point of view, so that we able now to create much of the jobs, sustainable approach in terms of the growth overall. But generally, I think you avoided to say it's a contractional budget. I don't know why, or contractional fiscal policy, because what is being presented at this current moment reflect that. And of course, there are a lot of disadvantages, because you can't then expect overall that will collect revenue, increase jobs, when it's contractionary. So what do we need to balance in order to make sure that at the same time we're not exactly employment agent, but we create that? I know maybe a commentary, if you link that to the Presidential Youth Employment Initiative, do you think that then, if you take in that, is it a way of creating jobs in a way, or is just a short-term expenditure which doesn't have much of the impact moving forward? So I think let me keep quiet. I had the other, let me say nothing. I had other questions, but I'm sure they will keep you busy, these ones.
Thank you. Veli, can we have one or two from F? Oh, the lights are in my eyes. I'm going to ask Vusi to manage the floor for a bit.
All right, then thank you so much. Okay, I was hoping that Michael is going to tap on this other aspect in terms of budget-wise. We have a problem in terms of saying the service costs in terms of the expenditure, and thinking that we incurred some debt to finance as these government expenditures. What has been the return of that? Have you actually structured that side of the finance, which is the debt financing? Now, because it's also a huge chunk of this budget cut, because if you're talking about the wage bill, you cannot as in talk about the wage bill without actually first talking about the debt service cost. So what is it that has been done in terms of budget, when in terms of structuring in that, as in how do you cut the cost that we are incurring in terms of the debt servicing of that? Or maybe if I would say and elaborate more and saying that, okay, when we incurred this debt, what was the revenue prospect that we're going to get, or actually the returns, or what the significant impact that it had in the economic growth versus the cost that we are actually paying for this service cost in terms of that particular expenditure? I don't know whether I'm clear or...
Vusi, one more question, and then I'm going to ask Michael to just respond.
Thank you very much, Michael, and good morning to everyone in the conference and those who are online. I want to check with regards to the political environment where the politicians are busy pronouncing the more jobs to be created. On the other side, as government, there is no enough budget. So what is it that National Treasury is doing to educate our politicians so that whatever they talk is aligned to the budget? This is the first one. And the second one is that hippopotamus jaws currently is showing that in 2022 the revenue is exceeding the expenditure. So does that mean now the country in terms of spending is better? But at the moment, we are having also some difficulties in terms of those circulars from National Treasury where the wage freezes and also the freezing of employment opportunities and infrastructure are being announced. But the hippopotamus jaws are reflecting that the revenue is exceeding the budget, or the revenue exceeding the expenditure. Thank you.
Thank you. Michael?
Yes, thanks for the questions. The question of growth is really the central question that I think we face. I tend to take the view that the fiscal challenges that we are facing are not caused by fiscal choices. that the fiscal challenges we are facing result from low growth. And growth has been low now for almost more than a decade. Since around 2012, we have been having stagnating per capita income. So our income per person in South Africa has been not increasing, and in the last few years it decreased quite substantially. And in the years going forward, it is expected that GDP per capita would still stagnate. So our growth rate, our economic growth rate, is below the growth rate of the population. And in those conditions, you're bound to get these fiscal challenges emerging. So fiscal policy, or the budget, it's not, for me, it's not so much that expenditure has been out of control or there's been some serious problem in the budget. The problem is the broader growth of the economy has been insufficient to support the budget we have. So fiscal policy is not the cause of the problem. I equally don't think that fiscal policy is the solution to the problem. You spoke, Dalu, about aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And if we look at the reasons for low growth right now, they are very much on the supply side. Starting with insufficient electricity generation. We're sitting now again at stage 6 load shedding. And so the idea that some kind of demand stimulus will create growth in the short run, even when we are unable to generate the electricity that factories need to run, I don't think makes a lot of sense to me. And there are other elements of the supply side that we should note are also falling very much within the public sector's role. The second big one is the logistics and transport infrastructure presided over by Transnet. Transnet's annual report issued earlier last week shows that the volume of freight carried by Transnet has fallen for a third consecutive year. And that is mainly due to supply. It's not because there's nothing to carry on the trains or there's no demand for the commodities. It's that we have insufficient capacity to carry the goods that people want to take to the ports. And the third big element, I think, for me, is the erosion of capacity in local government level and the deterioration of local infrastructure that we see. So I think that really we have a supply side problem in this economy, and there's not much you can do to stimulate demand in order to reverse that problem. And so we have a presidential employment stimulus, so-called. And if we just look at that stimulus on its own, and we don't place it in any context of broader economic developments, it does have some stimulatory effect, definitely. So in a community where you're now employing teacher assistants, there's employment that there wasn't employment before. But as I've noted, it's unfortunate that the number of teachers seems to be falling, even while the number of teacher assistants is our stimulus. I showed you how the number of people employed by the police has fallen by about 25,000 over the last decade or so. In the meantime, the Premier of Gauteng is employing crime wardens. So as we cut the police, we're employing crime wardens, and it's not clear to me that that constitutes a genuine stimulus. And I think the growth question is also fundamentally related to the question of debt that the lady at the back raised. Absolutely, the question of if you incur debt, what are you getting in return for the incurrence of that debt? And one of the big examples we can look to is the construction of the two largest coal-fired power stations in the world that we embarked on in around 2007, 2008, Medupi and Kusile. We are now, Treasury has allocated in the last budget 250 billion rand to bail out Eskom. And it's largely because Eskom incurred their debt in order to build those power stations. And those power stations are not worth the money that was spent to build them. In other words, if those power stations were functioning properly and delivering the electricity they were supposed to deliver, they would be paying for themselves. But because they're dysfunctional, because the money, we issued this debt and then built poorly functioning assets, we're left with the debt, but we don't have the stream of revenue that helps us pay that debt. So that's a fundamental question. But there's a second question, which is the relationship between growth and interest rates. Because not only do we have low growth, we also have very high interest rates on government debt. And what that means is that our debt service costs, as you mentioned, keep rising and rising and rising, and then we are forced to cut other expenditures in order to pay these debt service costs that are costs for debt incurred where we don't have the assets that would generate the revenue to pay those debt service costs. So these are very important questions and very problematic issues. The political environment, the third question I was asked, I think the colleague there mentioned education for politicians. I don't think that this is a question of education. I don't think the problem is that people don't know. I think the problem is that the incentives that politicians face lead them down this path of a contradiction between policy and the budget. They don't want to face the trade-offs that they should be facing. And so I think this is a question of leadership being unwilling to come to the table and face the difficult questions that they're elected to face. I don't think education can improve the quality of leadership. And lastly, just to say, I probably explained this badly about the jaws of the hippo, because the graph I was showing was the relationship between revenue and what I called their core expenditure, not all expenditure. So core expenditure, I'm excluding two important things there. The first is the interest payments, the debt service payments, and the second is the bailouts to state-owned companies like Eskom. If you exclude those things from the budget, then yes, last year you had a revenue was a little bit above core expenditure. And Treasury last year was very glowing about the fact that they had managed to achieve this primary surplus. But as subsequent events have unfolded, it's clear that that is just a temporary, it's not a permanent primary surplus. And because growth has been significantly lower than Treasury anticipated, revenue has been significantly lower than Treasury anticipated, and interest rates on government debt have increased substantially, the jaws of the hippopotamus, maybe it's opening again. So thank you.
Thanks, Michael. I want two questions from the online before we go to the opening statements of the panel members. Veli.
Thank you. We have a few questions. We'll start with Harris. One is from Harris Madugu. Why, Michael, do you think cutting more spending domestically is useful to cut inflation when the majority of our inflation is imported inflation? Then the second question and comment is from Yusuf from the National Treasury. He says the challenge with aligning government's fiscal and policy agenda is that we are still facing huge gaps in service delivery in most key sectors, and spending reductions will only make matters worse. So we'll pause there. There's more.
So I don't think I said, as far as I recall, maybe somebody will correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think I said that cutting spending is the way to reduce inflation. I think in response to both questions, what we need to recognize is that this is a real dilemma. There is not a simple answer to any of these questions. On the one hand, we are in an unsustainable fiscal position. And the longer we remain in that position, the more we are eating into our capacity as a state to address social problems. So in order to address social problems in the long term, we need a sustainable fiscal position. And so it's absolutely, I'm not arguing that it's wrong for Treasury or anyone else to argue for fiscal consolidation and the need to stabilize the growth in debt. Remember, that's all we're trying to achieve here. We're not even, although the IMF would like us to go in that direction, but as far as policy is concerned, we're trying to stop the increase in debt, not even reduce debt. So I don't think that that's a wrong thing to try and achieve. It's necessary. But on the other hand, continuous cuts to expenditure, which we've been doing over the last 10 years, firstly, they haven't got us closer to a position of stabilizing the debt. So there's that problem. But secondly, they have real consequences for services and real consequences for inequality. And simply because we think that consolidation and the budget deficit and stabilizing debt is an important objective, it shouldn't blind us to the fact that the way we are trying to achieve that objective is having a negative impact on the poorest in society. And therefore, we need to have a debate how we can achieve these two contradictory objectives at once. This is a real dilemma, which there's no clever economist that is going to give you the answers to these problems. They need a real social engagement and agreement in society about what sacrifices we are prepared to make in order to achieve the objectives that we want.
Thank you, Michael. I'm hoping that we are able to go to Debra for her opening statement online.
Good morning, everyone, and I stand on all protocols and observe them. Thank you so much for the opportunity to participate in this very topical, interesting, and key issue in our economy of South Africa. Michael, thank you for the presentation, and I will just touch on the few...
Waiting for sound from you.
I'll touch on few things, key things that I just want to add on or just to keep elucidating from the presentation. The first thing is what you have also said, which is the issue of the challenge we have first in the domestic economy, that we have experienced persistently weak fixed investment, high unemployment, and also low growth. And this has happened for most of the decade preceding the COVID-19 pandemic. And the reason for this dynamic growth has been largely due to long-standing structural weaknesses in the economy, which include inefficiencies in the network industries, specifically electricity, logistics, and also water and telecoms. Now, recently, we've seen that we continue to face these challenges. Mostly now is the issue of the intense and persistent load shedding that we are facing, and also the continued logistics problems that we are facing in the freight and rail sectors. Now, in addressing these problems, there's need for the implementation of structural reforms, and we've heard, or some progress has been reported from the Operation Vulindlela in terms of implementation of reforms, but this is not enough. More still needs to be done. And also noting that this doesn't solve the current challenges that we are facing. Now, government continues to provide the stable macroeconomic policy framework that is underpinned by flexible exchange rate, inflation targeting, and sustained fiscal policy to encourage investment. Fiscal policy works to stabilize the public finances, to reduce the economic-wide cost of borrowing, and also create the fiscal space needed in order for us to be able to respond to economic shocks when they occur. So in tandem with this policy setting, what is key is to encourage investment, accelerate implementation of structural reforms, and make sure that our potential GDP improves. Now, turning to fiscal policy per se, the key issue on government spending is mainly on the size, the structure, and the performance of spending. Just taking a step a bit, thank you for the presentation that you alluded to core spending, but to your point as well, when you were talking to the questions, when you look at spending overall, and I'm talking to consolidated government spending, you see that it has exceeded revenue since the 2008 global financial crisis, and also from 2008-9 to 2021-22, consolidated government spending, on average, it exceeded revenue and also has been exceeding growth in the economy. And this has been mainly driven by the public sector wage bill, the rising debt service costs, as well as the the transfers to households. We see that spending growth was not matched by efficiency gains. The composition of spending has deteriorated, with infrastructure declining as a proportion to total expenditure. Now, rising expenditure unmatched by revenue growth has led to primary deficits. And fiscal consolidation efforts has succeeded in narrowing the primary deficit from as high as the 3.7% of GDP from 2009-10 to 0.9% of GDP in 2018-19. However, this trend reversed, as we saw in the pandemic, where the primary deficit as well as the budget deficit increased quite significantly. And now, looking on the debt side, as a proportion to GDP, gross loan debt increased by 44 percentage points between 2009-10 and 2021-22. And we've seen that government debt increased much faster than the growth in the economy, and newly issued debt also became much more expensive. Interest payments, to the point that you've made as well, which is one of the key issues, is that it is now consuming 18 cents of every rand of revenue that government collects. Now, over the past several years, government's efforts to narrow the deficit and stabilize debt has been interrupted by several shocks that require fiscal intervention, and that includes the COVID-19 pandemic as well as the SOC failures. And these pressures were largely managed by reallocating funding within the budget and establishing firm ceilings. Now, over time, stabilizing debt and reducing debt service costs would enable government to shift expenditure to key policy priorities, and also it will reduce the economic-wide cost of borrowing, supporting investment and growth more broadly. So I'm just alluding to the point of why it is important to have sustainable public finances. Now, however, noting the high debt levels and the elevated borrowing costs, in a low economic growth, and also recently we've been having high inflation, it requires rising primary surpluses over the medium term. And in the 2023 budget, we spoke about the fiscal strategy that aimed to achieve fiscal sustainability by narrowing the budget deficit and stabilizing debt, and also ensuring that fiscal policy support economic growth through maintaining sustainable fiscal stance, as well as directing resources towards infrastructure and other policy priorities. And finally, in that strategy, we spoke about reducing fiscal and economic risks. Now, turning to recent developments, you also alluded to that, Michael, the issue of saying the economy has continuously grown quite slow. We've seen the reports yesterday, Statistics South Africa showed that the economy grew by 0.6% in Q2 2023, although it's higher than expected, higher than expectations. It is still low growth. Our revenues are performing below estimates, as we anticipated in the 2023 budget for the first quarter. And also we see that high unemployment is placing massive pressure on the social wage. So overall, the challenges that we are facing, and another thing is that the interest rates have increased quite sharply since budget. So overall, addressing South Africa's fiscal problems as well as the economic growth challenges, it requires a multi-stakeholder approach involving government.
Thanks, Debra. I'm going to ask my two panel members that's left, since Michael gave quite a bit of input already, to limit your time to about 5 minutes. What are the important points, Khetha, that you think you want to raise in view of the fiscal position, the impact on the economy, and how spending choices matter for us?
Well, firstly, I'd like to compliment Michael, Rashaad, Thokozile, and I think Owen in his absence on the paper that they've just released on the fiscal impasses that we face. I think in many ways, without endorsing everything they say in the paper, even though it comes from my alma mater, it highlights the real contradictions and policy choices that we face in this post-pandemic moment. And in many ways is a fair reflection of the challenges that need to be made in this upcoming medium-term budget policy statement and beyond. Michael, in his presentation and also in the paper, has highlighted a challenge that we keep on facing, and I don't know, Yolandi, if it's a mistake or if it just is the nature of things, which is banking on nominal booms and the cyclical uplift in revenues. I think when Edgar, the head of the budget office, spoke last week, I think he also spoke about this challenge of the fiscal illusion that comes from commodity upswings. And so, you know, in a world where maybe there is no further uplift in the commodity cycle, particularly as we see China decelerate, I think conversations like this are particularly important for us shaping fiscal policy going forward. Making this point that Michael raises in the paper around policy prioritization. I think they call it policy disarray in the paper. And so it's rather important that we make these points very clear that particularly the global context and dealing with public debt of over 4 trillion rand in the context of high interest rates and low growth, as Michael has said, there is no free lunch that there is no free lunch that South Africa faces. And I guess I was looking at one graph that Michael produced, probably since the 90s, early 90s, and with a brief period in the 2000s, free lunch conditions haven't prevailed in South Africa. And so it's just recognizing where we sit in the broader debates around fiscal policy, especially these very important debates about high debt, as well as this question of the free lunch. Finally, Michael talks about growth, and I think maybe to Dalu's point, and maybe the colleague at the back, I would be very interested in Rashaad, Thokozile, Michael, your view on this challenge that we face, and I think Ricardo Hausman talks about it as well, which is productivity. Now, in one way, Operation Vulindlela tries to address this because these are managerial reforms at their core, and Debra's spoken to some of them, addressing the SOC challenge. And over time, I think we want to see how these managerial reforms sort of feed through and support the spending framework. They outline different elements of spending, I think, in the paper. One of them is the security cluster and some of the choices that we face there. And I think in addition to talking about spending, I'd be quite interested in thinking about the productivity and managerial things that we can take from, say, lessons from Operation Vulindlela into the productivity space. They had a very cheeky line in the paper about ChatGPT and the issue of generative AI, which I think is quite interesting. You know, when we talk about sort of economic integration of people that, I suppose, or South Africa really in this broader context of technological transformation. One is what is their view? Certainly, I think the consensus is that in the short to medium term, it probably doesn't save us, but what can we do over the long term to think about the technology choices, productivity choices that we can use to support a higher path of economic growth.
Thank you. Rashaad, a couple of cheeky points in your paper. You may elaborate on that as well.
The editorial process is very robust. Thank you. So I think by way of introduction, just to make a few open remarks, that question was what are the fiscal challenges and what are the challenges associated with our spending choices. I think at the outset, if it's not stark enough, like the assessment, or at least my assessment and assessment of many people commenting on South African fiscal outlook, is that we're not in a sustainable fiscal environment, right? We are fiscally unsustainable. There's many definitions of sustainability. Debt is not likely to stabilize the share of GDP over the medium term. It may not be explosive in terms of its path right now, but it is certainly increasing in terms of its trajectory. Another component and one definition in an old IMF paper that I read was the idea of achieving a primary balance for debt to stabilize needs to be both economically, politically, and socially sustainable. And the implication of this is that even though we're borrowing at very high interest rates, even though revenue is consuming a large share, or a large share of revenue is consumed by debt service costs, the social and the political potential fallout from withdrawing certain types of social provision, be they justified or unjustified, and the general feeling is that 350 rands a month on the SRD is inadequate, but certainly justified from a moral and from a perspective of what the state's social contract with its population is. To do so would be politically or socially unsustainable. And so I think the imperative that emerges in today's discussion is really the imperative of growth. And when it comes to growth in fiscal policy, I think there are divergent views in terms of whether fiscal policy should purely be playing the role in terms of a stimulus, responding to short-term fluctuations, or is it more about a long-term outlook and the role of the state in providing the platform for growth? So we spoke about Operation Vulindlela and boosting the operating efficiencies of the country, the productive capabilities of the country, and so then policy choices need to be choices as opposed to us fumbling along and forced to make choices because of structural challenges with regards to the wage bill or structural challenges regarding the cost of borrowing. So I think choice is quite important. It's an active choice, not a false choice. So I think given the 5 minutes, we'll leave it at that and engage further.
Thanks, Rashaad. Can I take some comments from the floor for our panelists, given the opening statements?
Thank you. Thank you all. Just a few quick questions since you've all acknowledged the divisions between what the budget looks for or what the budget prioritizes and what government ironically also pushes. Don't you, as a panel, don't you think that the divergence is mainly an indication of the loss in capacity due to the departures of high-ranking personnel in National Treasury, and that's in the sense that they are unable to push what needs to be done in order to be passed through Parliament so that their objectives are prioritized, and their weakness is somehow leading to the Treasury ending up taking decisions that were not initially planned because of political pressure. Also, one last question. Considering the recent disappointing budget balance figures that we get each and every month, how do you guys think that we'll fund or finance the budget deficit that will likely accrue and will be larger than initially anticipated, considering that we already looking to clamp down on our debt levels? And lastly, okay, Michael, I know you're done with your stuff, but I was hoping that you just clear something for me on the sentence that inflation is a useful stabilizer. So I'm hoping you can clear that. I'm wondering what you meant by that. Thank you.
Thank you. Vusi, we've got the lady in green in front here, please.
Thank you very much. I was just thinking one of the issues, if we look at the social, political, and fiscal trade-offs, is for decision makers, whether it's politicians or whether it is people from the administration, to really have credible data available. So the question I've got is, how are we engaging on a practical level to start having the discussion at that level? Just as an example, when we talk the cost containment circulars, cut your comp of employees because we need to build hospitals. But have we really looked at how many hospitals are practically needed? Do we need new hospitals? Do we need to look at the maintenance issues? Where are they needed? Because the trade-off then, in terms of comp, becomes a different discussion in different areas. So we don't see from a practical perspective. So far our discussions are very academic, which is good. But if we want to influence decision makers, then we also need to bring in those practical examples of these are the implications and taking stock of what is happening in the social sphere as well. Practically, schools, healthcare systems. Have we unpacked that? Because that to me needs to inform and influence the options that we want to put out there in terms of analysis for decision makers, because then we can influence the decision making more effectively. And with that, I want to bring a solution to say we really do need to work with our tertiary institutions a little bit better in this regard. Because in government, it's very difficult for us to actually put up our hands objectively and say, listen, this policy is not working. Our means of monitoring and collecting data is geared to showcase. And it creates a false data set for accurate and more informed decision making. Annual reports that we reflect on, if we have to go back and look physically on the ground what is happening, I can tell you we'll see a very different story, and it will influence this debate in a very different manner. So I think it's just something that we need to look at in discussion and see how we can mobilize those resources and really use our universities, because I believe that they have a little bit more of an outside window coming in than for us, for example, in the government sector, trying to defend often the policy decisions that we are making.
Thank you very much. I actually want to add on to your question before I put it to the panel, in that we do know that a lot of times spending cuts fall disproportionately on departments with large staff complements, just because they need to absorb the increase in the wage bill within the current budgets. But how much should we hold the accounting officers of those departments responsible for how they actually cut their pie? And it relates to your question around practical decisions and data-driven decisions rather than this is what we've got. A lot of times Treasury is held responsible for many decisions that I personally think we may want to ask the accounting officers of those departments and why they've made the decisions that they have made with the budget that they've got. Panel members. Rashaad, maybe I should start with you.
Well, there's only one that I'd like to comment on. Is it purely an absence of data or information when it comes to decisions that are not purely technical decisions? I mean, I was just watching a TED talk once and speaking about the importance of data when it comes to policy making, and there was a respondent, and the respondent was saying, like, it's pretty patronizing to expect elected officials to just use one data point in making a decision. And the respondent said it's better than no data points, because quite often MPs, whether domestically or abroad, don't really look at real data and guiding. It's purely about realpolitik and expediency. So I do think that's something inherent in the political process, and by nature democracy has that built into it. I do think there is something to be said about tying the incentives, and you try and do that with elections, you try and do that with electoral scoring, you try and do that with getting involved in fiscal anchors. You try and do that with having expenditure ceilings to try and constrain public officials, and especially elected officials, from making decisions that may not be in the best long-term interest, but those come with their own added set of challenges, and we can unpack that further, the limitations and the benefits of fiscal anchors or fiscal rules.
Khetha.
Right. Firstly, I'll endorse your call to work with universities. That's why we work with the University of the Witwatersrand, one of the greatest universities on the continent and in the world. No, I think that's very important. Look, I think the government spending reviews, probably at this point in time, just because I'm looking at the post, have provided quite a great deal of data sets and analytics and better understanding or building some insights about different aspects of public spending. But yeah, to the point that we can triangulate this data. Of course, we want to do that. Recently, we've been working on an issue that, Michael was in the budget office. We started, but really at its fruition, which is public sector balance sheet reporting in collaboration with the SARB. And I think over time, if you really want to understand the fiscal capacity of the state, that's probably a very important reform that started quite small, looking at public entities, and then grew to, say, working with the property management and trading entity, right? Which not necessarily renowned for its managerial capabilities, if you look at the number of audit findings that they get. But over time, projects like that grow. So, I think collaboration where we can find it is really important. And as you said, credible data sets are quite important in terms of influencing decision makers. There was a question on inflation and reducing the debt stock. Now, the preconditions of this is that, look, again, really it's not so simple, right? Because the inflation has to be sort of unanticipated, and you face the risk of bond repricing if you're continually surprising markets. So I think, and then I think they're just, in the context of South Africa having this exotic debt, right, or not a reserve currency, there is no impetus for, I think, investors, particularly given the fact that, 24-25% of our bondholders are foreign, for them to ask them to accept that capital loss and probably the risk on the exchange rate as well, in order to flatter our deficit position. So I'm not too sure that saying we can do inflation will somehow save us from the challenge of winning consensus around maybe, say, sound finance is the answer. So I don't think there's any easy solutions to that question. I don't know if you want to, the accounting officer question is really hard. Because ultimately I suspect they'll say they're responding to political imperatives as much as they're trying to do their best. And,
Michael, 2 cents worth.
So, yes, on the inflation, probably I agree entirely with Khetha that, so the point I was making is that in the post-COVID period, we had an unanticipated surprise inflation. Nobody expected that there would be a commodity boom coming out of the COVID period. Nobody expected that there would be this inflation, and when it came, people were saying it's transitory, and there was all of those debates. So for the whole world, there was an unanticipated inflationary shock. And when there's a surprise inflation, it's good for the fiscal metrics, because debt is issued in nominal terms. So it's a rand amount of debt, and if the rand is now worth less, then in real terms, your debt is also worth less. And then I made a second point, which is that going forward, we're not going to be having this unanticipated inflation. In fact, the Reserve Bank is moving to kind of shift the inflation target from a range to a point. So they want to reduce inflation, and they're going hard on ensuring disinflation. And in those conditions, fiscal consolidation is going to be even harder. Now, none of those 2 points should be interpreted to say that we should somehow have a policy of high inflation in order to solve our fiscal problem. But on the other hand, a tolerance for a little bit, the question that we can raise is does it make sense to say we must have a very sharp consolidation of the fiscus, and at the same time we must have a very sharp reduction of inflation? Trying to achieve both of those things at the same time is going to be exceedingly difficult. And you may want to say, let's put our emphasis on one or the other. The only other point I wanted to make is just in response to the question about Treasury capacity. To say, I really don't, this is something that is often spoken about in the media, and I think it's entirely wrong. That certainly our fiscal capacity, I think, as a country has declined in recent years. But the reason for the decline in our fiscal capacity has nothing to do with the competency or otherwise of the individuals in National Treasury. When the kind of great heroes of Treasury, Lesetja Kganyago, we have here Andrew Donaldson, Kuben Naidu, and the kind of A-team was running National Treasury in the 2000s. We had very rapid economic growth of about 4 or 5%. We had very low interest rates. We had a government that was united and a president that supported National Treasury. Those are the things that have changed. And if you took the Treasury A-team from the 2000s and put them in the conditions that we have today, which are so much more difficult, I doubt that they would be able to perform much better. So that's why when Duncan was appointed as DG, I sent him a message to say, never forget that when Momo changed all the rules and created the PFMA, he was younger than you are now. And we're now dealing with the problems that he created in those times and his absence of foresight. So I think having younger people, having new people, we have a wealth of experience in Treasury, we have a wealth of experience outside Treasury, and we really need to think about how the institutional environment has changed, how the economic environment has changed, rather than saying some individuals with great capacity will kind of be the messiahs who will come in and save us from ourselves. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Debra, if you're still online, if you want to make some closing remarks before I close out the session.
Sure, thanks, Yolandi. I'll just add one thing. It's with regards to the question or point that was made in terms of the trade-offs and availability of the data. For me, what that brings to mind is the importance of the spending reviews that I think we'll also talk about during this conference. So it actually shows like the reviewing of spending, efficiencies, and what needs to be done, exactly in line with what the commentator was saying. That is all from me. Thanks.
To close off this session, this does not mean that the conversation's over. Please note that this thematic area pulls through both days. So I think it's important that we have the conversation going on for both. The next session, I believe, will have some labor issues and fiscal and public economics added to that. So I hope everybody is looking forward to that. Thank you again. And thank you, panel members.